F4U Corsair, first combat mission Guadalcanal, February 1943. Dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the jungle still heavy with mist. Then came a sound no one had heard before, a banshee scream tearing through the sky. Japanese pilots looked up, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the myth of invincibility began to crack. For nearly 2 years, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had been the rapier of the Pacific sky. Light, impossibly agile, and with a combat radius that stretched farther than any Allied fighter, it cut its way across China, Malaya, the Philippines, and finally, Pearl Harbor. To its pilots, the Zero wasn't just a machine. It was a second skin, an extension of instinct honed in endless dogfights. But even the sharpest blade has its flaw. The Zero carried no armor behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. At high speeds, its controls stiffened the ailerons and rudder locking as if frozen in air. Against energy tactics, boom and zoom dives, the hunter could suddenly become the prey. By early 1943, Japan's myth of invincibility faced a harsher reality. Operation K, the withdrawal from Guadalcanal, began January 14th. Under the cover of night and weather, destroyers ferried exhausted troops off the island. On February 7th, the last units slipped away. 2 days later, America declared Guadalcanal secure. But the skies above the Solomons were still lethal. Japanese fighters from Buin and Rabaul flew cover missions trying to shield convoys probing American defenses. Every flight over Henderson Field was still a gamble, an ambush waiting in the clouds. The Imperial Navy still clung to its creed, Kuntai Kessen, the idea that one decisive fleet battle would settle the Pacific. But on Guadalcanal, that doctrine was bleeding away. Instead of battleships clashing, attrition ruled the day. Pilots, fuel, and machines ground down one mission at a time. Into that crucible, the Marines rolled out a new predator. The F4U Corsair, bent wings crouched like talons, arrived just as the island fell quiet on the ground. But in the air, a new storm was about to break. February 12, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. VMF 124, the first Marine squadron to receive the F4U Corsair, rolled their new birds onto Kukum Strip call sign Fighter 2. Their baptism would not be a practice sortie, not a routine patrol, but a combat escort deep into contested skies. The task was simple but never safe. A PBY Catalina flying boat lumbered towards Sandfly Bay, searching for downed airmen. Slow, exposed, a magnet for Zeros. 12 Corsairs climbed to 18,000 feet, their wings bent like talons above the fragile rescue craft. Minutes into the flight, radio crackled bandits. 9 Zeros rising from the southeast, probably from Buin or Balal. Veterans, men who had already killed. The Marines didn't flinch. Major William G.C. led the roll-in. Corsairs inverted, then dove. At over 400 miles an hour, the Zero's fragile frame could not follow. This was boom and zoom, the one tactic that cracked Japan's rapier. The clash was brief, almost clinical. Zeros twisted, but found no turning fight. Corsairs slashed, fired, and climbed away. The Catalina survived. The Marines returned without loss. It wasn't a grand victory, more like a proof of concept. The Corsair could fight, it could protect, but it hadn't yet broken the Zero's myth. 2 days later, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the Corsair met its first real test, and it bled. Mission escort B-24 Liberators on a raid against Kahili Airfield at Buin. Japanese fighters swarmed. What followed was no clean debut. It was a massacre. By the end, America had lost 2 Corsairs, 2 Liberators, 2 Warhawks, and 4 Lightnings. The Japanese, at most, 4 Zeros. For the Marines, the message was sobering. This new bird was powerful, but not invincible. The Corsair's legend would not be written in a single morning. It would take months of blood adaptation and tactics learned the hard way. February 12th proved the Corsair could survive. February 14th proved it could also die. When the Corsair first met the Zero, the difference was obvious in the numbers. Top speed 425, sometimes over 440 miles per hour in a dive. The Zero barely 330. In the Pacific, speed wasn't just convenience, it was survival. A Corsair could choose when to fight and when to walk away. A Zero pilot once caught had no such choice. This gap transformed tactics. In a turning circle, the Zero still ruled. But in vertical maneuvers in the dive and the climb, the Corsair owned the sky. The Corsair carried 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, 12 rounds per second per gun, 70 to 80 rounds every heartbeat, enough to saw through aluminum frames like paper. It was a weapon built for energy fighting, 1/1 kill. The Zero's armament was elegant but limited. 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.7mm machine guns. The cannons hit hard, but carried only 60 rounds per gun. In a prolonged dogfight, Zero pilots often fired in short, precious bursts. Corsair pilots could hold the trigger down, flooding the sky with lead. For American pilots, survivability was not optional. The Corsair had armor behind the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks. A pilot hit might limp home. A plane burning might still land. For the Zero, lightness was both gift and curse. No armor, no protection for fuel. A single incendiary round could turn it into a torch. Veterans like Saburo Sakai knew this too well. One bullet, one spark, and the fight was over. The Corsair was heavy, over 14,000 pounds loaded. On paper, it could never match the Zero's nimbleness. But war isn't fought on paper. In real skies, energy fighting ruled. Boom and zoom, dive, strike, climb away, never turn, never slow down. The Zero, barely half that weight, danced in horizontal turns. Against Wildcats, it seemed untouchable. Against Corsairs, it found itself fighting an enemy that refused to dance. Every detail of the Corsair screamed radical. The inverted gull wing, a shape born not of beauty but necessity. Its massive 13-foot propeller demanded short landing gear, or the nose would bite the ground. The solution: bend the wings down, then up again. Strange, unorthodox, but brilliant. Inside the R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders, over 2,000 horsepower. It was twice the muscle of the Zero's Sakai engine. Power gave speed, speed gave choice, and in war, choice is life. Technology alone doesn't win wars, but it changes how men fight. American pilots climbed into Corsairs knowing they had armor, firepower, and speed. Japanese pilots climbed into Zeros knowing one hit could end them. Confidence grew on one side, fatalism grew on the other. Side by side, the Zero was still a deadly rapier light, precise, lethal in expert hands. But the Corsair was a broadsword, brutal, heavy, and in mass production. In 1943, one Zero could still outturn a Corsair, but a dozen Corsairs diving together could not be stopped. The age of elegance was over. The age of raw power had begun. Every Corsair pilot drilled one truth into his skull: never turn with a Zero. In a flat turn fight, the Japanese fighter could outcircle anything. The only path to survival was discipline. Deny the horizontal dance fight only on your terms. For rookies, instinct screamed to pull harder to match the enemy's circle. Those who listened to instinct died. Those who obeyed training lived. The Corsair's real weapon wasn't just its guns. It was energy. Altitude into speed, speed back into altitude. Hit, climb, strike again. Every dive, a hammer blow. Every climb, a shield. It was the purest form of asymmetric warfare. The Zero fought in graceful circles, a knife fight in tight quarters. The Corsair fought in slashing arcs, a predator swooping down, then vanishing before the enemy could touch him. Discipline was the difference between legend and casualty. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington drilled his black sheep: stay high, stay fast, never give him your belly. If you feel the urge to turn, don't. Corsair squadrons became masters of patience. Wait until the Zero bled energy. Wait until the formation stretched thin. Then strike like hawks, one pass, one kill. Every dive carried a sound, the whistle of air tearing past the Corsair's wing roots. To Marines, it was just aerodynamics. To Japanese veterans, it became something darker, an omen. In diaries, Japanese pilots spoke of terror of opponents who struck from above and vanished. In America, the legend grew into a name: whistling death. A sound that meant the hammer was falling. On April 1st, 1943, over the Russell Islands, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh put these rules to the test. Outnumbered, he stayed high. He dove, fired, and climbed. In minutes, 3 Zeros were falling. Walsh became the Corsair's first ace. In September, Boyington's VMF 214 met 50 Zeros over Balele. 20 fell. None of his Corsairs were lost. It was textbook energy, fighting discipline, made flesh. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots knew the script. They no longer sought turning duels. They dreaded the high-altitude shadows. Where once the Zero had dictated the fight, now it reacted. The balance of the Pacific sky was shifting. The Corsair had rewritten the rules of combat, not by matching the Zero's elegance, but by refusing the duel and inventing a new one. From early 1943 into 1944, the Corsair was more than a duelist. It became the backbone of the Cactus Air Force, the ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and Army flyers at Henderson Field. Day after day, Corsairs bled the Zero dry. They didn't win with one decisive strike, but with 1,000 cuts, raids, escorts, interceptions. At Rabaul, once the fortress of the South Pacific Corsairs and their allies turned a citadel into a prison. Runways cratered, harbors littered with wrecks. By late 1943, over 100,000 Japanese troops sat stranded, supplied only enough to exist, never enough to matter. Yet the Corsair was only one blade in America's arsenal. To understand its legacy, we must set it beside its siblings. The F-6F Hellcat was the hammer of the fleet. Built in staggering numbers, flown from carrier decks across the Pacific, it racked up more than 5,000 kills, by far the highest of any U.S. fighter. Its kill ratio, 19-1. If the Corsair was the Marines' broadsword, the Hellcat was the Navy's industrial sledgehammer. In the Southwest Pacific, General George Kenney's Air Force leaned on the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Twin engines, long legs, perfect for escort and interception across the vast distances of New Guinea and the Philippines. It was P-38s that ambushed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, decapitating Japan's most brilliant strategist. The Corsair didn't match the Hellcat in numbers or the P-38 in range, but it filled a crucial role. The spearhead of the Marines, the guardian of airstrips, wrestled from jungle and coral. From the Solomons to the Philippines to Okinawa, the bent-wing bird carried the fight where it mattered most, over men on the ground who needed cover. For Japan, the war had been built on Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle, but Guadalcanal shattered that illusion. The air war was no longer about one clash of carriers. It was about grinding attrition, supply lines cut, strongholds isolated. The Corsair was a scalpel in that strategy, slashing Rabaul into irrelevance, keeping the pressure unrelenting. Every convoy sunk meant less food, less fuel. Every Zero lost was another pilot Japan could not replace. By 1944, the Empire's finest aviators were gone, replaced by boys with 60 hours of training sent against hardened killers in Corsairs and Hellcats. It was not a fair fight. It was annihilation. By the end of the Solomons campaign, the Corsair had proven itself. It gave the Marines parity, then superiority. It turned Henderson Field from a besieged outpost into an anvil on which Japanese air power was broken. And it carried that momentum forward to the Philippines, to Leyte Gulf, to the desperate skies of Okinawa against kamikazes. In the grand accounting of the Pacific, the Hellcat won the numbers war. The P-38 proved decisive in the Southwest Pacific. But the Corsair embodied something else, resilience, transformation, and the Marine ethos of taking a beast too wild for carrier decks and turning it into an icon. Strategy is more than maps and numbers. It is what machines allow men to believe. For Japan, the Zero was once the symbol of invincibility. By 1943, that myth was broken. For America, the Corsair was proof that innovation and discipline could turn fear into dominance. In the Solomons, the tide shifted. In Rabaul, the fortress became a prison. And from that shift came the long march west island by island until the rising sun itself was eclipsed. Corsair backbone of USMC Air Power, 1943-45. From the legend of the Zero to the age of the Corsair. In just 2 years, technology and tactics reversed the balance of the Pacific. What once inspired fear now bred confidence. What once seemed untouchable became prey. By 1944, the Corsair returned to the carriers it once terrified. The British Fleet Air Arm had shown the way, modifying wingtips, perfecting a curved approach to land safely on deck. The Ensign Eliminator became a trusted guardian of the fleet. The war ended, but the bent-wing bird kept fighting. At Okinawa, Corsairs tore kamikazes from the sky, saving thousands of sailors. In Korea, they flew 80% of Navy and Marine close air support missions, hammering tanks, bridges, and convoys. French Corsairs fought in Indochina. Latin American squadrons kept them in service for decades. In 1969, during the Soccer War, Corsairs clashed in the last piston-engine dogfights in history, 3 decades after their birth, still deadly. The Zero was a rapier-light, agile, deadly in the right hands. The Corsair was a broadsword, heavy, powerful, crushing everything before it. But victory was never just a duel of blades. It belonged to the system, to production lines that never stopped, to training that produced thousands of skilled pilots, to logistics that carried fuel and ammunition across half the world. The Corsair was the face of that system, its scream in a dive, its shadow over the battlefield, its mark in the memories of friend and foe alike. On the morning of Japan's surrender, Corsairs flew above Tokyo Bay. Their shadows crossed the waters, where once the rising sun seemed unstoppable. It was a silent message: the age of the Zero was over. The age of American air power had begun. Some figures shown are war totals, not single battle counts. The nickname Whistling Death is widely cited in U.S. sources. Evidence of Japanese use remains debated.